Hello, TDT readers. I'm Alithia from TheDroptimes, and I'm joined by Owen Lansbury, who is a part of the Drupal South committee. We have called Owen here to discuss Drupal South. This year, the event is to take place in Wellington, New Zealand, and to get an insight into the workings of Drupal, we will be asking him all about it. Firstly, it's really nice to have this discussion in person, and I think I would like to start about asking a little bit about Drupal South. Now we know that it is the longest running Drupal event in the Asia Pacific region. And we do have a glimpse of Drupal South, of course, on the Drupal South website. We know about the geographical area, but I don't want to miss on the opportunity of asking it from you face to face for you to be able to describe to us what is the area that Drupal South kind of covers.
Yep, sure. I should introduce myself. My name's Owen Lansbury. I have been on the Drupal South committee since 2018. And prior to that, I've had a lot of involvement in organising events, right back to DrupalCon in Sydney in 2013. I'm also on the Drupal Association board at a global level. So I think just some history of Drupal South is that it actually started as an event called Drupal Down Under back in 2008. So I think that's 15 years ago. And it was actually started in New Zealand. So there was a few Kiwis that were very early Drupal adopters who were very enthusiastic, and they started the first Drupal Down Under events. Actually, no, they were called Drupal South back then too. I'll just look at my list here, and I should shout out to Bevan Rudge, who was the organizer of those early events. And then the first event that was held in Australia was in 2011, and that was called Drupal Down Under. And so we had two events in Australia, 2011, 2012. And then we actually had DrupalCon come to Sydney in 2013. So that was the one that I was involved with. And that was actually the Drupal Association globally coming to Australia, putting on an event. We had quite a global audience attend that. And it's still the biggest one that we ever ran. So I think we had about 430 people attend that. Dries came and did a keynote. A lot of international people came and took part in the sprints. And so for the past 10 years, what we've tried to do is we consolidated on the name of Drupal South to represent both Australia and New Zealand. And we've tried to alternate between Australia and New Zealand, normally on a 2 years in Australia, one year in New Zealand. So the last one that we did in Wellington was 2014. Then we had Melbourne and the Gold Coast, 2014-15, and then back to Auckland in 2017. And then we came back to Australia for 2018 and 2019. And then in 2020, something happened that we couldn't do conferences. I can't remember what it was. Something called COVID.
Yeah.
But we actually ran some very successful online events. So we had a Drupal Gov focused event in 2020 that had 340 people. And then 2021, we had a short format virtual conference that had 3 editions through the year. And then last year in 2022, we came back to Brisbane for our first in-person event since COVID. And this year, we're going back to New Zealand to Wellington. So that's everything that we've ever done.
Yes, thank you for that. I think you just did explain about how you decide on, where to base Drupal South every year, but
Yep.
how would the organizers kind of like decide on that location? And for
Yep.
example, this year it is in Wellington. As you mentioned, I think the last time it was in Wellington was in 2014. Yeah, so how would the organizers kind of decide on that?
Yeah, so I should explain that up until 2018, all of the events had been organized just by independent groups. And so what would tend to happen is we'd get to the end of one conference, and then a couple of people would have a conversation about where the next one would be, and then someone would volunteer to take that on. They would lose a year of their life, and then we'd have an event at the next place. So we didn't have a lot of continuity in terms of how we were planning the events. And so in 2018, we formed the Drupal South Steering Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And so that committee is formed of 5 people, 2 from New Zealand, 2 from Australia, 1 from either country. And the idea is that that committee oversees the strategy for the event in the longer term, so that we've got some continuity there. And then we also, in the past 3 years, we've engaged a professional event organizer to manage the logistics of the
Mm-hmm.
event for us. So prior to that, it was purely volunteer. And I think the issue that you have when it's quite a big conference is that if you're volunteering your time, it's an incredible amount of time that you're having to volunteer. So we have moved to that kind of semi-professional model where there's a committee that sets the strategy and then a professional organizer that handles the logistics. In terms of choosing locations, so our mission as Drupal South is to represent Australia and New Zealand. And so it's always going to be in Australia or New Zealand. It's not really an Asia Pacific event. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. But what we try and do is ensure that we've selected a location that is the easiest for the most people to attend.
Yeah.
So we've never done an event in Perth, and I don't think we ever will, mainly for the reason that coming from Auckland, it would be a 10 to 12-hour trip, whereas if it was in Sydney, it's a 3-hour trip. So that's the biggest factor in terms of how we choose a venue. The second thing is whether we have quite a good local community in that location. So we always have a lot of volunteers who are still working on the event in terms of content selection and management, and then also helping out at the event as people doing the tickets and those types of things. And obviously having volunteers who are local to the event helps, but also having a local community that can get around the event and help promote it is also important for us. So I think that they're the main factors.
You did mention, you talk about how, when they decide on a place, someone would give a year of their life to volunteering and trying to
Yeah.
arrange all these details. So volunteering is quite an essential aspect of especially Drupal events. And
Yep.
could you tell us a few ways members could kind of help in volunteering, at least like this year, upcoming years at Drupal South?
Yeah. So the committee themselves are all volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had 5 years of my life on that committee now. I'm just rolling off this year. And obviously it's not a full-time thing, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
behind the scenes work that has to happen. So volunteering for the committee is essential. We need to have a good team there that's enthusiastic and can keep the event happening. And then for the events themselves, the most important group is the content selection or the speaker selection team. So the way that that's structured is that we have a track chair who oversees the people selecting their speakers, and then that person then oversees the program coordination. And then for each topic in the conference, so normally we'll have 4 or 5 different tracks. So back-end development, front-end development, UX design, content, all of those types of things. So we have a track lead that's responsible for actually selecting the speakers in that track, and then they liaise with the other track leads to ensure that there's no double ups or that the program can fit together well. And then the other volunteering is more on the actual days of the event. We'll have people helping out with ticketing at the ticket booth when people are coming in to register, coordinating sponsors who are setting up booths, monitoring rooms, so making sure that speakers have the right AV gear and those types of things. And that's generally it in terms of volunteering. So this year, we've got a great team, as always. And so I think any opportunities that are going to be available in the future, they'll be publicized well in advance of the event. And I think from the committee perspective, what we've tried to do is to be looking at least 1 to 2 years in advance in terms of where the next events will be. I do know where the next event will be, but that'll be announced in Wellington. And then we'll have a year, or a bit under a year, to organise that event.
Yes. Well, I think now you just did speak about volunteering. When it comes to the attendees, people who are going to be attending Drupal South, who do you think, or who should make it to Drupal South, and who is Drupal South directed towards?
Yeah, so this has always been something that's been quite difficult to balance, because I think you have a lot of different audiences within the Drupal community that have different needs. So of course there's the developer community, and that can be broken down into front end, back end, and a little bit of site building. And what we've tended to find is that audience is very advanced these days. So Drupal's been running for 20 years. Most people have been working in it for about 10. And so what we've tried to do with our developer tracks is to keep the focus quite advanced and quite detailed. And we'll always indicate the kind of level of expertise that those talks have. So whether they're entry level, medium complexity, or high complexity. But the general trend is that they are generally more advanced. The other audiences are more on the content editing side of things. So site builders, content editors, and they tend to be people that work within organizations a lot of the time. So the end user or the clients of the agencies that are building the websites. And they tend to be quite hard to reach, those audiences. So we have a lot of reliance on our key sponsors, tend to be Drupal agencies and Drupal hosting companies. And we have a lot of reliance on them to actually reach out to their clients to say, hey, there's this conference happening. There's a lot of content that will be relevant to what you do every day with Drupal, and we'd encourage you to come. And we have discounted tickets for sponsors to be able to invite their clients on that basis. And then design and UX, it's always been a factor in the conferences, but it's never really been a core focus. So we'll have design and UX kind of mixed in with a lot of content topics most of the time. And I think what we tend to find is that most of the Drupal agencies that are building Drupal websites, they will have an in-house design team in most cases, or they work with external partners. And a lot of the topics that we talk about in terms of UX for Drupal do tend to be quite universal across web development. So it's only if you're talking about very specific theme topics that we would get into Drupal specific topics for UX and design. Otherwise, those talks do tend to be quite general, and it's a good way for the Drupal audience to understand what the trends are that are occurring in the broader web development community. So all of the focus on front-end frameworks and how to design for those, and component-driven design, those types of concepts. A lot of those ideas haven't necessarily formed in the Drupal world. They've been imported, and that's the role of those. And then the final audience is the business decision makers. So the people that are running Drupal businesses, people that are running Drupal teams within organizations, or people that are choosing content management platforms for their organizations. So they tend to be either project managers or executives who are making those decisions. And so we always try and have a showcase track of case studies about big complex Drupal websites and how they can be applicable to different industry sectors. So whether it's government or higher education or healthcare, we'll always have quite a good mix of those types of case studies. So if someone's coming to evaluate Drupal as a choice that they're considering, then we've got content for them to be able to understand what you can actually do with Drupal. Yeah.
You did mention that you'll be stepping down, I guess, this year from the volunteering committee.
Yep.
But I think I would like to bring a little focus on you and your role in Drupal South this year. Would you be able to just give us a little insight into your role, as well as what is your wish for Drupal South in the upcoming years?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start that answer by saying that Drupal is a do-ocracy. So if you want to see something happen, then just get on and do it. And that's always been uh, something that I've paid a lot of attention to. So when we as a company first started using Drupal in Australia, there was maybe 2 or 3 other companies that were doing that at the time. This is like late 2000s. And so for us to actually establish a reputation for Drupal in Australia, we had to do a lot of that work ourselves by promoting Drupal, not necessarily our own company. And so a lot of my early experience with being involved in Drupal events came from the idea that for our company to be successful, Drupal needed to be successful. And if Drupal was successful, that was going to be good for everyone. And so what we've seen over the past 15 years is Drupal grow into a multi-$100 million industry in Australia and New Zealand. And there's probably 30 or 40 agencies that would specialize in Drupal in this region to varying degrees. So it's become something that's quite significant. And we always kind of say that our biggest competitor in the Drupal world is Adobe. So if we're pitching on a big project, then it's more than likely that there's a big consulting firm coming in and pitching Adobe to them. So without getting too far off track, my goal has always been that if Drupal is successful, then everyone else benefits in the Drupal community. And so as far back as 2013, when we ran DrupalCon Sydney, the intention there was to really put Drupal on the map in this region. And we definitely did that at that event. So we had a government minister come and talk who was responsible for IT policy at the time. Drupal got heavily adopted within government through that period as well, and it still is probably the largest used CMS in government. And then all of the subsequent events that I've been involved with since then have been just to maintain the momentum and continuity and the notion of professionalism around the Drupal world. So I think people still probably think that open source is more of a grassroots, do-it-yourself style approach to software development, but that is not the case at all. I mean, the companies that are building Drupal sites in this region these days, as would be the case in your country, are big multinational consulting firms charging tens of millions of dollars for projects in some cases, and using Drupal in preference to things like Adobe. And so I think an event like Drupal South is really, really important to maintain that sense of professionalism, of knowledge sharing and collegiality within the community, and also amongst competitors to drive competitors to do better. And I think we have a very strong competitive ethos within the Drupal agency world here. And I think the good thing about Drupal South is that we can come together. We're all friends, but we're friends who are competitors. And a lot of the time, what we're doing as competitors is looking at what other companies are doing in this space, and then ensuring that we're working to the same standard. And that just benefits everyone at the end of the day. So just to kind of wrap up that very long-winded answer, I did see kind of around the mid-2000s that we did need to maintain that continuity. And so with a couple of other people in the Drupal community, we formed a pre-committee to establish the subcommittee, so that we would have that long-term continuity. And so for the last 5 years, we've had 3 rounds of elections of people into that committee. And my goal was to always be at a point at this point in time to be able to step away from that and know that the structure of that committee would be able to sustain itself without relying on one individual. And that's definitely been something that we've been able to achieve quite well. So, and then I think the final part of the question is where I'd like to see it go. And so I think we do have a very, very high level of professionalism with our events. I mean, I think people often get caught up in the notion of, is it a camp? Is it a con?
Yeah.
We've always been of the attitude that this is the only big Drupal event in our region, and it needs to be of a global standard in terms of the quality of the event. And so we always have it at a good venue. We always have a very strong focus on speaker selection and really focus on the experience of anyone attending to make sure that it's on par with what they might be paying thousands of dollars for a commercial conference. And obviously there's a cost that is attached with doing an event to that level of quality, but we've always tried to keep that as low as possible for the actual attendees.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us this insight into Drupal South. And it's really nice to hear from someone face to face to learn more about these events. I guess that really does bring us to an end into what Drupal South is like an event. So Owen, thank you so much for this opportunity for me and TDT to ask you these questions. And all the best for Drupal South this year. We hope to, see a very successful event, which I'm sure it will be. I think that brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you again
Great.
once again.
Thank you. And if anyone's interested in Drupal South, the web address is drupalsouth.org.